My name is Natalie. I'm in my early 30s, and for most of my adult life, I've worked inside organizations where calm is mistaken for compliance and competence is confused with availability. I'm not the loudest person in the room. I don't dominate meetings. I don't have confidence. I've learned that when you move through the world like that, people project their own conclusions onto you. Usually harmless ones. Sometimes not. People tend to describe me as steady, reliable, easy to work with. Those are compliments that sound generous until you realize they're also permissions. Permissions to overlook you, to joke at your expense, to assume you'll absorb discomfort quietly because you always have. I've been underestimated in ways that weren't dramatic enough to protest, but sharp enough to remember. This story isn't about revenge. It's not about public takedowns or explosive moments. It's about time. About what accumulates when disrespect is normalized and silence is misread. It's about a moment that looked small to everyone else but lodged itself somewhere permanent in me. My manager joked about my mental health in front of the team. It was framed as humor. It landed as truth. Everyone laughed. I never forgot. What followed wasn't a confrontation. It wasn't even visible. It was an internal shift. Slow, methodical, and irreversible. Over the next several years, I learned how power actually works when you're not the one performing it. I learned how systems rely on people like me staying predictable. I learned how patience can look exactly like passivity right up until it doesn't. This is a first-person account of that process. Not dramatized, not sanitized. There are no villains here, just patterns. Patterns that thrive when no one names them. I won't exaggerate the harm, and I won't minimize it either. I'll tell you what happened, what I noticed, what I chose not to say, and why the quiet decisions mattered more than the loud ones ever could. If you're expecting a cathartic blow-up, this won't be that. If you're curious about how psychological reversals happen without anyone raising their voice, you might recognize something familiar. This is a story about restraint, documentation, and timing. About understanding leverage without announcing that you have it. I'm sharing this because these moments rarely get narrated from the inside, because many of us carry versions of them alone. And because silence, when chosen deliberately, can become a form of authorship over your own life. Before I go on, have you ever had a moment that everyone else forgot by the next day, but you carried with you for years? Before anything went wrong, I was useful in a way that made me disappear. At work, I was the person things quietly routed through. If a process broke, I fixed it. If a deadline was fuzzy, I clarified it. If a project was missing context, I filled in the gaps without making it obvious that gaps existed in the first place. People liked working with me because working with me felt smooth. There were no raised voices, no drama, no friction that could be traced back to me. In meetings, I sat slightly back from the table. Not physically distant, just not performative. I listened more than I spoke. And when I did speak, it was usually to summarize what everyone else had already circled around but hadn't landed on yet. That earned nods. Occasionally, a good point. Rarely credit. I didn't mind that. At least not at first. There's a comfort in being underestimated when you don't yet understand the cost. Being overlooked can feel like safety. No one scrutinizes you too closely. No one competes with you. No one feels threatened. To them, I was dependable background noise, the kind you only notice when it stops. My manager, Ethan, saw me the same way. Not with malice, with an assumption. He assumed I could handle more. Assumed I wouldn't push back. Assumed I'd absorb stress because I always had. In performance reviews, he called me low maintenance. He meant it as praise. What he really meant was that I didn't require emotional attention. In group settings, I was the quiet one, the one who didn't jump into office banter or escalate jokes. When conversations drifted towards sarcasm or light mockery, I smiled politely and stayed neutral. That neutrality became part of my image. People decided it meant I was unaffected. Or maybe that I didn't mind. What they didn't see was how closely I observed tone shifts. Who spoke over whom? Who got laughed with and who got laughed at? I noticed patterns long before I named them as such. I just didn't comment on them. There's a particular role women like me get assigned in workplaces like that. Not the star, not the problem, the stabilizer. The one who makes everyone else look better by comparison because she never asks for the spotlight. The one whose emotional range is assumed to be narrow because she keeps it private. I fulfilled that role well. When new hires joined, I onboarded them. When leadership needed context, I provided it without editorializing. When mistakes happened upstream, I quietly corrected downstream consequences so clients never saw the mess. Over time, my fingerprints were everywhere, but my name rarely was. That invisibility wasn't accidental. I cultivated it. I believed professionalism meant restraint, that competence should speak for itself. If you did good work consistently, recognition would eventually follow. I didn't yet understand that systems don't reward silence. They rely on it. To my coworkers, I was safe, predictable, not someone who would escalate a comment or question intent. If a joke landed awkwardly, I'd be the one to smooth it over with a small smile, a return to the agenda. That taught them something about me, whether they realized it or not. It taught them that I would hold the room steady at my own expense. Looking back, I can see how neatly I fit into the story they had written for me. Natalie doesn't get rattled. Natalie doesn't take things personally. Natalie will handle it. Natalie is fine. I was not fine, but I was contained, and containment reads as consent to people who benefit from it. At that stage, there was no singular offense I could point to. No dramatic injustice, just a series of micro-assumptions stacking quietly on top of each other. Each one is small enough to dismiss. Together, they built a version of me that existed only in their minds. And once a role like that solidifies, people feel entitled to test its limits. I didn't know it yet, but I was being positioned. Not consciously, culturally, as someone whose boundaries were flexible because they were never articulated out loud. That's who I was to them. Not weak, not insignificant, just invisible enough to be convenient. The first moment didn't arrive with drama. It never does. It happened during a weekly team meeting, the kind that blurs together after a while. Same room. The coffee is cooling too fast on the table. Same rhythm of updates that everyone half listened to while waiting for their turn to speak. I was there to report on a project I'd been coordinating for weeks. One that had quietly absorbed several last-minute changes without anyone above me noticing the strain. I gave my update calmly. I always did. I mentioned a revised timeline, explained the dependencies, and flagged a risk that could be mitigated if decisions were made early. It was concise, neutral, useful. Ethan leaned back in his chair and smiled, not at me, in the room. "Well," he said lightly, "Natalie's got everything tracked like a therapist's notes. I swear, if anyone ever needs a breakdown, she's got one ready." There was a beat of silence. Then laughter. Not cruel laughter, not explosive, just enough. The kind that spreads because it's easier to join than to question. Someone chuckled to my left. Someone else added, "Hey, at least someone's organized." As that softened it, I felt the heat rise in my face before I could stop it. Not because the joke was devastating, but because it landed sideways. Because it reframed my diligence as pathology. Because it touched something private without permission. Mental health wasn't a concept I joked about. I'd spent years managing anxiety quietly, responsibly, invisibly, like everything else. No one at work knew that. No one needed to. But the joke didn't need accuracy to do its work. It only needed plausibility. I smiled. Of course I did. A small one. Controlled. Enough to signal I wasn't offended. Enough to keep the meeting moving. That smile did more damage than the joke ever could. The conversation rolled on. The moment passed. By the time we stood up and gathered our laptops, it was already gone for everyone else. A throwaway comment. A bit of levity. For me, it stayed, not because it hurt deeply in isolation, but because it revealed something. It showed me how easily my composure could be repackaged into a punchline, how my attention to detail could be framed as instability, how my silence could be interpreted as permission. I replayed it later that night while washing dishes. Not obsessively, just once, enough to catalog it. Ethan hadn't looked at me when he said it. He'd looked at the room. The joke wasn't for me. It was about me. That distinction mattered. I told myself not to overthink it, that he probably meant it as praise, that humor in offices is clumsy and rarely malicious, that if I made a thing of it, I'd seem sensitive, difficult, exactly the opposite of the person I was known to be. So I did nothing. No email, no comment, no boundary. I didn't even write it down, not yet. I let it sit in my head unfiled, unresolved. What I didn't realize then was that moments like that don't fade when they're ignored. They just wait. They become reference points. The first data point in a pattern you don't want to believe exists. After that meeting, nothing changed on the surface. Ethan treated me the same. The team treated me the same. But something subtle had shifted internally. A small recalibration. A quiet alert system flicks on. I started noticing tone more. Not just directed at me, but around me. Who jokes traveled through? Whose expense was considered safe? Whose reactions were monitored and whose weren't? That was the first small cut. No blood, no scene, just enough to make me pay attention. After that meeting, nothing dramatic happened. That was the problem. If Ethan had apologized, or if someone had checked in with me afterward, the moment might have closed itself. Instead, it stayed open. Subtle, unresolved. And in that openness, it quietly taught everyone something. It taught them that the comment was acceptable. It taught them I would absorb it. The next instances were smaller, quieter, almost invisible unless you were looking for them. A comment about me being too calm during a stressful sprint. A joke about how I never seemed fazed when deadlines piled up. Someone once said, "If Natalie ever cracks, we're all doomed." And everyone laughed again. I laughed too, lightly, on cue. Each time I told myself the same story. They don't mean harm. This is workplace banter. Don't be that person. I'd built a reputation on being unbothered, and I wasn't ready to dismantle it over something I couldn't easily explain without sounding fragile. So I normalized it. I adjusted my internal language first. I stopped calling it disrespect and started calling it a misunderstanding. I told myself they admired my steadiness and just didn't know how to articulate it well. I reframed jokes as compliments in disguise. That reframing made it easier to stay quiet. But normalization has a cost. The more often something happens without consequence, the more it solidifies as truth. Soon, people didn't just joke about my composure, they relied on it. I was assigned projects others found overwhelming. Last-minute fixes, emotional labor disguised as just looping Natalie in. If I looked tired, someone would say, "You're fine, you always are." It became a kind of mythology. I noticed that when I raised concerns, they were acknowledged politely and then deprioritized. When I flagged a risk, it was noted and then delayed. My calm delivery worked against me. Urgency doesn't land when it isn't dramatized. Meanwhile, louder voices, less informed ones, shape decisions in real time. I'd watch meetings veer off course and feel the familiar pull to intervene. Sometimes I did. Sometimes I didn't. Each time I didn't, it reinforced the idea that I was there to support, not to lead. Still, I didn't confront it. Not because I didn't notice, but because I understood the social math. Speaking up would cost me social capital I wasn't sure I had. Silence felt safer. Rational. I also didn't trust my own reaction yet. The initial joke still echoed, but it hadn't been repeated explicitly. I wondered if I was projecting, if my sensitivity came from outside the room, not inside it. That self-doubt was convenient, for everyone but me. There's a particular exhaustion that comes from managing perception instead of reality. constantly adjusting your internal responses so others don't have to adjust their behavior. I carried that exhaustion quietly. I told myself it was professionalism. Over time, something else happened. I stopped expecting better. When comments came, I mentally filed them away instead of bracing. I learned the rhythm, knew when to smile, knew when to deflect. That's how disrespect becomes ambient. It doesn't announce itself. It blends into the background until you can't tell where it began. What I didn't know then was that this normalization was doing two things at once. It was shrinking how others saw me, and sharpening how clearly I saw them. Patterns become obvious when you stop hoping they're temporary. I still wasn't angry. Not outwardly. I was observant, quietly alert, paying attention in a way that felt different from before. I hadn't decided to act yet, but I had stopped forgetting. There's a moment when you realize you're no longer being evaluated. You're being used. Not maliciously, systemically. I saw it in how tasks were framed around me, not as opportunities, but as inevitabilities. Natalie will handle it. Loop Natalie in, she'll figure it out. My name became shorthand for resolution, not authority. I wasn't consulted for decisions. I was brought in after decisions were made to make them workable. That was the role. Reliable, useful, invisible. In meetings, I noticed that when I spoke early, people listened politely. When I spoke late, they listened selectively. Timing mattered more than substance. I was allowed to contribute as long as I didn't redirect momentum. My value was operational, not directional. No one ever said this explicitly. Roles like mine don't need to be announced. They're reinforced through repetition, through who gets follow-up questions and who gets follow-up work, through who is credited and who is depended on. Ethan once told me, "You're such a stabilizing presence." He said it like a gift. I heard it like a ceiling. Stability, I learned, is only admired as long as it doesn't ask for change. I watched others grow. People with less context but more visibility moved into roles where their ideas were amplified. I trained some of them, wrote documentation they'd later reference as best practices. When they spoke with confidence using language I'd authored, it stung in a way I couldn't easily articulate. Still, I stayed quiet. Part of me believed that this was temporary, that consistency would eventually convert into recognition. Another part of me feared that speaking up would recast me as emotional or difficult, the very traits I'd been subtly associated with through jokes I never challenged. There was also a deeper truth I hadn't yet named. I was afraid of disrupting the equilibrium. When you're the one holding systems together, you're acutely aware of how fragile they are. Causing friction feels irresponsible. Selfish. So I accepted the role. I became the person who anticipated needs before they were voiced, who preemptively fixed issues so no one else had to, who absorbed stress without externalizing it. In doing so, I made myself indispensable and easily overlooked. The irony is that invisibility often masquerades as autonomy. I had flexibility, trust, access. No one micromanaged me. That freedom felt like respect until I realized it was also insulation. I was insulated from growth, from advocacy, from being seen as someone whose trajectory needed intention. The jokes never escalated. They didn't need to. Their work was already done. My emotional boundaries were assumed to be non-existent. My reactions were pre-written. And then something subtle happened. I stopped internalizing the role. I began to see it as something imposed rather than chosen. That distinction changed how I held it. I was still performing the same tasks, but I was no longer emotionally invested in the narrative around them. I watched how quickly people noticed when I fixed something, and how slowly they noticed when I didn't. I observed who followed up and who didn't, who asked questions and who assumed answers. The role was clear now, and once you can name a role, you can decide whether to keep playing it. I hadn't decided yet. But the illusion that this was mutual, benign, or accidental had broken. The shift didn't come with anger. It came with clarity. It was an ordinary afternoon. No meeting. No comment. Just me at my desk, reviewing a thread that had spiraled without my input. A decision had been made quickly, loudly, and incorrectly. I could see the fallout before it happened. I always could. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, ready to intervene, to correct, to stabilize. And then I stopped, not out of spite, out of curiosity. I asked myself a question I'd never allowed myself before. What happens if I don't fix this? Not catastrophically, not dramatically, just enough to let consequences follow their original trajectory. That pause lasted maybe 10 seconds. It felt longer. In that moment, I understood something fundamental. My silence up until then hadn't been neutral. It had been reactive. I was responding to needs as they arose, smoothing over disruptions as a reflex. What I was considering now was different. It was intentional. I didn't send the message. Instead, I opened my notebook, the black leather one I kept tucked in my bag. I'd used it before for ideas, for tracking progress, for personal reflections. That day, I used it differently. I wrote down the decision that had been made, who made it, what information was missing, and what I predicted would happen next. It wasn't vindictive. It was precise. The issue unfolded exactly as expected. A minor delay. A confused client. A rushed internal fix that required more resources than if it had been handled correctly the first time. I was looped in later, of course. I fixed it then. Calmly. Efficiently. No one connected it back to the earlier moment when my input would have prevented it. That was the point. I felt something settle in me. Not satisfied. Alignment. For the first time, I wasn't measuring my value by how quickly I could repair someone else's oversight. I was observing the system as it was, not as I wished it to be. That afternoon, I realized I'd been operating under an unspoken contract. I will protect you from the consequences of not listening to me. No one had asked me to sign it. I'd volunteered. And contracts can be renegotiated. I didn't become colder. I didn't disengage. I became selective. I started asking myself whether my interventions were actually invited or just expected. I also began documenting more consistently. Not emotionally. Chronologically. Decisions. Timelines. Dependencies. Where information flowed and where it stalled. I noticed how often my calm delivery was used to retroactively justify decisions I hadn't endorsed. This wasn't about exposure. It was about understanding leverage. Silence, I learned, isn't just absence. It's a shape. And when chosen deliberately, it can reveal the architecture of power very quickly. Nothing on the outside changed that day. I still smiled, still participated, still delivered. But internally, I had crossed a line. I was no longer trying to be seen. I was trying to see clearly. Once silence became a choice, it changed texture. Before, my quietness had been reflexive. Polite. Designed to keep things smooth. Now it was deliberate. Measured. I spoke when clarity was needed, not when comfort was expected. The difference was subtle enough that no one named it. They just felt it. I stopped volunteering information preemptively. Not critical information, just the kind that rescued people from their own lack of preparation. If someone asked a vague question, I answered it precisely, without filling in the gaps they hadn't thought to consider. If a meeting drifted toward assumption, I let it. People interpreted this shift exactly as you'd expect. They assumed I was tired, overworked, distracted, still harmless. Silence, when chosen, is often misread as weakness by people accustomed to being carried. I noticed Ethan growing slightly impatient. He'd ask, "Natalie, any thoughts?" Later in discussions than before. As an afterthought. When momentum was already set. When my input could decorate a decision but not shape it. Sometimes I spoke. Sometimes I didn't. When I did speak, I was careful. I didn't over-explain. I didn't soften my points with humor. I stated facts and implications. I watched who leaned in and who checked out. Attention patterns are data. I also noticed how much people relied on my tone to regulate their own comfort. When I stopped cushioning statements with reassurance, others became uneasy. They filled the silence with jokes, with justifications. with nervous elaboration. That was new. I began to understand that my calm had functioned as emotional infrastructure. Removing it, even partially, revealed instability elsewhere. Still, no one confronted me. No one asked if something was wrong. The assumption held: Natalie doesn't need checking in on. Natalie is fine. I let that assumption stand. Behind the scenes, I continued documenting. Quietly. Methodically. I tracked when decisions bypassed the established process. When risk was acknowledged verbally but ignored structurally. When accountability blurred upward. This wasn't a dossier. It was a map. I also started declining certain requests. Politely. With reason. Not defensively. Just enough to introduce friction where none had existed before. Each "I don't have capacity for that this week" landed heavier than I expected. People adjusted, reluctantly. Silence doesn't announce itself, but it changes dynamics. It forces others to sit with their own responsibility. At no point did I feel triumphant. If anything, I felt detached, observant, like I'd stepped slightly to the side of a current I'd been swimming in for years. The jokes stopped. Not because someone decided they were inappropriate, but because my reaction no longer anchored them. Humor needs feedback. Without it, it withers. No one noticed that shift consciously. I did. And in that space, where silence was no longer automatic, I started to see what they never did. What they never noticed was how much I learned by stepping back. When you stop performing reassurance, people reveal their habits, their blind spots, their shortcuts. I saw how often decisions were made based on confidence rather than accuracy. How timelines were approved without understanding dependencies. How responsibility floated upward only when success was guaranteed, and downward when it wasn't. I was no longer in the center of the machinery. I was watching it from just far enough away to see how it actually worked. I noticed who documented things and who relied on memory, who followed the process and who bypassed it because they could, who spoke decisively in meetings and then quietly reversed themselves in private messages. Patterns like that are invisible when you're busy smoothing them over. I began organizing my notes differently, not emotionally, structurally. Dates, names, decisions, outcomes. I didn't annotate with judgment. I let reality speak for itself. Most people assume documentation is bureaucratic, defensive. What it really is power that doesn't need to raise its voice. I also noticed how often my work was referenced indirectly. We've always done it this way. The process already accounts for that. Those processes were mine. Authored by me, maintained by me. But no one remembered that. Ownership had blurred into infrastructure. That invisibility became leverage. Because when you understand how indispensable systems are, and how few people actually understand them, you realize that visibility isn't the same thing as control. I quietly updated the documentation, clarified ownership, tightened language, removed ambiguity. Not to trap anyone, but to make accountability legible. Every change was clean, defensible, aligned with best practice. No one objected, no one paid attention. I also started building relationships laterally, not networking in the performative sense, just paying attention to who respected precision, who asked real questions, who followed through. I learned where trust actually lived in the organization, and where it was just implied. They never noticed any of this. They still saw the same Natalie, calm, efficient, unbothered. What they didn't see was that I was no longer reacting. I was preparing, not for revenge, for exit options, for autonomy, for a future that didn't depend on being underestimated. The most dangerous assumption people made was that my silence meant I was static. That was because I wasn't visibly pushing. I wasn't moving. I was, just not where they were looking. The reveal didn't come as a shock. It came as confirmation. By then, I had months of notes. No complaints. Not interpretations. Just sequences. Decision, action, outcome. Over and over. When you lay patterns side by side, they stop feeling personal. They become structural. One evening, long after most of the office had gone quiet, I stayed behind to finish documenting a process update. The building was nearly empty, the kind of quiet that makes keyboards sound louder than they are. I remember pausing, rereading what I'd written, and realizing something I hadn't let myself say out loud yet. A significant portion of our operational stability depended on systems I had built and maintained. Systems no one else fully understood, not because I'd hidden them, but because no one had ever bothered to learn them. That realization landed with weight, not excitement. There was no surge of triumph, just a steady, grounding clarity. This wasn't ego, it was math. I traced workflows backward. If I stepped away from certain touch points, what would break first? Not catastrophically. Subtly. Delays. Confusion. Misalignment. The kind that erodes trust over time. I also reviewed how credit moved. Who presented outcomes versus who engineered them. How narratives were shaped after the fact. My name was rarely in those stories, but my work was everywhere. That night, I understood my leverage for the first time. Not as a threat, but as an option. Leverage doesn't demand action. It offers choice. I didn't feel angry about the joke anymore. Or the laughter. Those moments had done their work already. They'd pushed me into seeing clearly. Into understanding that respect in that environment wasn't something you earned by endurance. It was something you enforced by structure. I closed my notebook and packed my bag. I didn't stay late often, but that night felt important. Like closing a chapter internally. On the way home, I thought about all the times I'd minimized my own awareness. All the times I'd told myself it wasn't that deep. That I was reading too much into things. I wasn't. The reveal wasn't that I was undervalued. I'd known that. The reveal was that I no longer needed to argue for value. I just needed to decide how and where I wanted to apply it. Once you see your leverage, you can't unsee it. The question isn't whether to use it. It's how. I gave myself time. Not days. Weeks. I didn't rush into action because nothing was on fire yet. Rushed decisions are emotional decisions, and I'd already promised myself this wouldn't be about emotion. I listed my options privately. I could confront Ethan directly. Name the pattern. Ask for acknowledgement. Maybe even an apology. That path offered clarity, but no guarantee of change. It also required me to make myself emotionally legible to someone who'd never shown much curiosity about that dimension of me. I could escalate. HR existed for moments like the joke, the laughter, the normalization. But escalation turns lived experience into policy language. It narrows the context. It invites defensiveness. And it would mark me permanently in a system that already struggled to see me accurately. I could stay. Continue as I was, now armed with awareness. Use my leverage quietly to negotiate better terms. A role change. A title adjustment. More authority. That option tempted me the longest. Familiarity has gravity. And then there was the irreversible option. To leave. Not abruptly. Not noisily. But deliberately. With structure. With timing. Leaving wouldn't punish anyone. It wouldn't teach a lesson in the way people imagine lessons being taught. But it would remove a stabilizing force that the system had come to rely on without recognizing it. I weighed that carefully. I asked myself whether staying would require me to keep minimizing myself. Whether any future recognition would arrive without me having to translate my worth into something palatable. Whether I could unlearn the role they'd assigned me while still occupying the same space. The answer was no. Not because they were malicious, but because systems don't change for the convenience of the people holding them together. They change when pressure is applied, or when support is withdrawn. Leaving wasn't an act of aggression. It was alignment. Once I named that internally, everything settled. The noise quieted. I stopped replaying conversations, stopped wondering how things could have gone differently. The decision was made long before anyone else sensed it. I didn't tell anyone yet. There was nothing to announce. I simply began preparing the ground. When you choose the irreversible option, you don't look for validation. You look for precision. Once the decision was made, I became very quiet, not withdrawn, Not disengaged, just precise. I didn't change my performance. I changed my timeline. I reviewed my contracts. Not with suspicion, just clarity. Notice periods, knowledge transfer expectations, non-competes. Everything was clean. I made sure my actions would be unassailable. I updated the documentation thoroughly. More thoroughly than ever. Not to make myself replaceable, but to ensure that when I left, there would be no ambiguity about what existed and what didn't. People often confuse documentation with redundancy. They're not the same. I also began conversations outside the company. Not desperate ones, measured ones. I spoke to former colleagues, industry contacts, people who'd seen my work without filtering it through office dynamics. I didn't oversell. I didn't vent. I described what I'd built and how I'd built it. Those conversations felt different, grounded, accurate. Inside the office, nothing looked unusual. I still attended meetings, still met deadlines, still helped where help was explicitly requested. I simply stopped compensating for others' lack of preparation. Small delays appeared, minor miscommunications, nothing alarming, just enough to register as friction. Ethan noticed first. He asked if everything was okay. I said yes, it was the truth. Because for the first time in years, everything was. Silence can be disarming when it's no longer performative. People expect emotional signals. When they don't arrive, they fill the gap with their own interpretations. I let them. I didn't hint. I didn't warn. I didn't position myself as irreplaceable. I let the system reveal its dependencies naturally. When I accepted a new offer, quietly, gratefully, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt resolved. Like closing a door you've already walked through in your mind. There was still one step left. Timing. I waited until a natural pause. A project cycle is ending. A transition point that made my departure clean, not chaotic, respectful, not reactive. When I finally scheduled the meeting, my hands were steady. Moving in silence had done its work. The consequences didn't arrive with my resignation. They arrived in the space after it. When I told Ethan I was leaving, the meeting was brief. Almost disappointingly so. He blinked once, leaned back in his chair, and asked a few procedural questions. Timeline, transition, whether I'd already accepted something else. I answered calmly, clearly, no emotional subtext, no long explanations. He nodded, thanked me for being transparent, and said we'd connect again closer to my end date. That was it. No reflection, no curiosity, no backward glance. At first, that stung more than I expected. Not because I needed validation, but because it confirmed something I already knew. My presence had been taken for granted so completely that its removal hadn't yet registered as real. People underestimate departures that don't come with drama. Calm exits look reversible in the imagination. The first few days after the announcement felt almost normal. Slack messages continued. Meetings proceeded. My name still appeared on agendas. There were a few polite, "we'll miss you" comments. Kind, but generic. The kind you say when you don't yet understand what's leaving with the person. Then the questions began. They were small at first. Hey, can you remind me how this report pulls data? Do you know why this automation behaves like this? Where's the doc that explains the escalation path? I answered all of them, but something had changed. Before, I would have layered my answers with context, with a preventative explanation, with foresight. I would have said, here's how it works, and here's why, and here's what to watch out for later. Now I answered the question that was asked, precisely, completely, and no further. That difference mattered more than anyone realized. As my calendar shifted toward transition meetings, the tone shifted too. These weren't collaborative conversations. They were extraction sessions, information downloads, attempts to compress years of lived familiarity into an hour. I came prepared. I shared documentation, walked through processes, explained the decision logic, which had been formally recorded. Everything I provided was clean, accurate, and defensible. What I did not provide was intuition, the unspoken, watch this person. The this usually breaks when. The this looks fine now, but wait 2 weeks. Those things had never been requested when I was staying. They weren't owed now. As days passed, small inefficiencies began surfacing. Meetings ran longer than usual. People circled decisions without landing them. Someone approved a change that contradicted an existing dependency and didn't realize it until late in the process. Normally, I would have intercepted that quietly. This time I let it unfold, not maliciously, not passively, just without intervention. The result wasn't chaos, it was discomfort. The kind of discomfort that reveals how much invisible labor has been cushioning the system. I noticed Ethan's tone change before his words did. He started looping me into conversations earlier, asking for my input, just in case. There was a slight urgency there now, still unspoken, but present. One afternoon, he asked, "Is there anything else we should be aware of before you go?" It was a broad question, too broad. I answered honestly, "Everything critical is documented." He nodded, but something in his expression flickered. A hesitation, as if he sensed that the answer was technically complete and still insufficient. That's the thing about institutional knowledge. You don't realize how much of it lives in people until they stop volunteering it. As my final weeks approached, the atmosphere shifted again. The office didn't panic. Panic would have required awareness. What emerged instead was confusion. People started stepping on each other's responsibilities. Two teams assumed the other owned a task I'd quietly coordinated between them for years. Emails multiplied. Slack threads lengthened. Small tensions surfaced. I wasn't at the center of them anymore. That absence was loud. I could feel people recalibrating their expectations in real time. Not consciously, behaviorally. They were learning, slowly, that the stabilizing force they relied on wasn't just a function of the role. It had been a person. Ethan asked for another meeting. This one was different. He asked whether I'd consider extending my notice period. Just a bit, to ensure continuity. He framed it as concern for the team. I listened. I didn't interrupt. Then I declined, politely, calmly, without explanation beyond logistics. I already had commitments. My timeline was firm. He didn't push. But the dynamic had shifted. The assumption that I would accommodate, that I would stretch to protect the system, was gone. And with it, a certain ease. After that, the request became more pointed. Can you walk us through why this exists? Is there a reason this was set up this way? What happens if we change this? I answered when there was documentation. When there wasn't, I said, that context isn't captured formally, which was true. It had lived in me. In meetings, people started saying my name differently. Not casually, carefully. As if realizing, too late, that I'd been holding more than they'd acknowledged. Still, no one apologized. No one referenced the jokes, the laughter, the assumptions. That wasn't surprising. Systems don't apologize, they adjust. By my last week, the office felt heavier. Not sad, just strained. Conversations were shorter. Humor was cautious. People checked each other's reactions more. The ease was gone. On my final day, there was a small send-off, cake, polite speeches. Ethan thanked me for my contributions and said I'd be missed. I smiled, thanked everyone, kept it brief. As I packed my desk, I felt something unexpected. Not relief, completion. The consequences had begun. Not as punishment, not as spectacle, but as a quiet recalibration of reality. They were finally learning what my silence had been carrying. By the time the panic surfaced, it was already misdirected. It didn't arrive with urgency toward me. It caused confusion among them. I was gone from the building, but not yet gone from the system. My name still lived in documents, in comments. In places, people didn't notice until something failed quietly, and no one knew who to ask. At first, they tried to patch things up with meetings, extra meetings, alignment meetings, quick syncs that weren't quick. They talked around problems instead of through them. People who had once relied on my quiet mediation now had to negotiate directly with each other. It was uncomfortable. You could hear it in the pauses. In the way, voices sharpened slightly when no one stepped in to translate. The first real panic showed up as irritation. Why is this taking so long? Didn't we already solve this? Who approved this change? Questions without clear owners. I heard about it through former colleagues who checked in, casually at first. Things are a little messy without you. We didn't realize you were doing all that. Comments framed as compliments, but carrying a delayed awareness that couldn't be acted on anymore. Ethan reached out again, not formally, not dramatically. Just a message asking how I was settling into my new role. A soft opener. A test. I replied kindly. Briefly, truthfully. Then he asked if I'd be open to a short call. Just to get some perspective. Perspective is a funny word. It sounds reflective. It often means help us fix this. I declined, not coldly, not defensively. I said my schedule was full and wished them well. That was the moment it became too late, because what they needed wasn't a call. It wasn't advice. It was the version of me who had lived inside their system long enough to anticipate its fractures. That version of me no longer existed there. Inside the company, the tone shifted again. From irritation to self-protection, people started documenting more, looping leadership earlier, asking for clarity they'd never needed before. The workload is redistributed unevenly. Some people overcorrected, others disengaged. What surprised me most was how often my absence was discussed without naming me. We should have had better continuity. We relied too much on informal knowledge. We need to build redundancy. All true, all late. No one ever said, we misunderstood her role. No one said, we laughed when we shouldn't have. They framed the loss as structural, not relational. That made it easier to swallow. I watched this from a distance, with an unexpected calm. There was no satisfaction in it, just recognition. This is how systems process loss when accountability would require discomfort. A few weeks later, I heard they were hiring. Not for my role exactly, but for 2 adjacent ones. Splitting responsibilities that had once lived quietly with me. It made sense. What one person carries invisibly often looks impossible once it's gone. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt resolved, because by the time they understood the cost, the decision had already done its work. My life had moved forward. My energy was being spent in rooms where steadiness wasn't mistaken for silence, and precision wasn't framed as pathology. The moment for fixing it had passed. Not because I was unavailable, but because the version of the system that required fixing was no longer mine. Some lessons arrive after the door closes, not as punishment, as a consequence. The confrontation didn't happen the way people imagine confrontations. There was no raised voice, no dramatic reveal, no moment where I finally said everything I'd been holding in. It happened months later, quietly, when the emotional temperature had already cooled. Ethan asked to meet for coffee, not officially, not through HR. Just a message that read, would you be open to catching up sometime? I'd really value your perspective. I considered not responding. I didn't owe him closure. But I also didn't feel threatened by the conversation anymore. Distance has a way of neutralizing power. So I agreed. We met in a neutral place. A cafe neither of us frequented. Late afternoon. Quiet enough to talk without being overheard. He arrived a little early. That alone told me something. We made small talk first. Safe updates. He asked about my new role. I answered honestly, but briefly. I asked how things were going. He hesitated before answering. Challenging, he said. We didn't realize how much you were holding together. I nodded, not in agreement, in acknowledgement. There was a pause then, the kind that invites confession without demanding it. I've been thinking a lot since you left, he continued, about how the team dynamic worked, about what we might have missed. He didn't look at me when he said that. He looked at his coffee. I waited. Eventually, he said my name, carefully. I want to ask you something, and you don't have to answer. I didn't interrupt. Was there something that pushed you to leave? That was the moment. Not explosive, not triumphant, just precise. I took a breath, not to steady myself, but to choose my words. I wasn't there to accuse, I was there to be accurate. Yes, I said, there was. He looked up then, fully. I didn't list grievances. I didn't narrate years. I didn't mention HR, policy, or patterns. I focused on one moment, the one that mattered. There was a meeting, I said calmly, where a joke was made about my mental health. In front of the team. Everyone laughed. His face changed. Not dramatically, but noticeably. Recognition flickered. I never addressed it, I continued. Not because it didn't matter, but because addressing it would have required me to step out of the role I was already being assigned. He started to speak. I raised my hand slightly, not to stop him, but to pace the conversation. I'm not saying this to blame you, I said. I'm saying it because that moment clarified something for me, about how my composure was being interpreted, and what that meant for my future there. He was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower. I don't remember that joke. I know, I said. That's kind of the point. That landed. I didn't soften it. I didn't sharpen it either. I let it sit between us. He apologized then. Not defensively, not performatively, just simply, for the comment, for the culture, for not noticing sooner. I accepted the apology. Genuinely. But acceptance doesn't mean reversal. I want you to know, he said, we've changed some things since you left. We're being more intentional. I'm glad, I said, and I meant it. There was no satisfaction in watching him process regret. Just clarity. Regret is heavy, but it's also late. Before we parted, he said something that stayed with me. I always thought you were fine, he said quietly. I met his eyes. I replied. I just wasn't staying. That was it. No hug, no absolution, no open wounds. Just truth, delivered without heat, when it could no longer cost me anything. Some confrontations aren't about winning. They're about naming reality, once, so you never have to carry it again. I'm not who I was when this story began. Not because I hardened. Not because I became louder or more aggressive or more visible in the ways people expect growth to look. I didn't reinvent my personality to survive what happened. I refined my boundaries. In my new role, people describe me with some of the same words as before. Calm. Thoughtful. Precise. The difference is that those qualities are no longer extracted from me by assumption. They're invited, respected, contextualized. When I speak now, it's earlier. Not because I have more to say, but because I understand timing. I don't wait for the room to be quiet before contributing. I don't translate urgency into softness so others can digest it comfortably. I state what I see and let it land. If someone jokes at the expense of seriousness, I don't smile reflexively. I pause. That pause does the work my old silence never could. I also no longer confuse invisibility with safety. I understand now that being overlooked is not neutral. It's a condition that benefits others more than it protects you. What changed most, though, is internal. I trust my interpretations. I no longer talk myself out of discomfort just because it isn't loud. I don't require repetition to validate impact. One moment can be enough to justify attention. Enough to justify change. I still document, still observe, still move carefully. But it's no longer in response to being underestimated. It's because I value clarity. There's no bitterness when I think about my old team. No resentment toward Ethan. Everyone was operating within a system that rewarded certain behaviors and ignored others. I stepped out of it instead of trying to correct it from the inside. That decision gave me back something I didn't realize I'd lost. Agency. I don't carry the joke with me anymore. Not as a wound, as a marker. The moment I stopped negotiating with a version of myself that had to endure quietly to be acceptable. Who I am now is someone who still believes in restraint, but not at the cost of self-erasure. Someone who understands that silence is powerful only when it's chosen, and that sometimes the most decisive move is leaving a room that keeps mistaking your steadiness for consent. There's a temptation, when a story like this ends, to look for a villain, to flatten the experience into right and wrong, hero and antagonist, cruelty and justice. That version is easier to digest. It gives us someone to blame and something to defeat. But that wasn't what this was. What happened to me didn't begin with malice. It began with an assumption, with the quiet agreement that composure equals resilience, that silence equals consent, that if someone doesn't object, they must be unaffected. That's a dangerous misunderstanding. The truth is, many systems are held together by people who are least protected by them, people who absorb friction quietly. Who corrects errors without spectacles? Who regulates emotional temperature so others can operate comfortably? Their work disappears into the structure. Their presence becomes background until it's gone. The moral of this story isn't to make jokes, though that matters. It isn't safe to speak up immediately, because that isn't always safe or strategic. And it isn't wait until you break, because breaking isn't a prerequisite for change. The moral is this: pay attention to what silence is carrying, in yourself and in others. If you are the quiet one, your calm does not obligate you to endure. You are allowed to choose when silence serves you and when it costs too much. Leaving is not failure when staying requires self-erasure. And if you are the one who benefits from someone else's steadiness, ask yourself why. Ask whether you've mistaken reliability for limitless capacity. Ask whether the people who make things work are also the ones being overlooked when it comes time to acknowledge impact. No one in this story lost their job. No one was humiliated. No dramatic justice was delivered. And yet something irreversible happened. A system recalibrated. A boundary became real. A life moved forward. Sometimes accountability doesn't arrive as punishment. It arrives as an absence. If you've ever carried a moment everyone else forgot, something small, dismissed, laughed off, what did it teach you about the room you were in? I'd really like to hear your story.